Okay, Chris Speaks here today, back with former Congressman Mo Brooks. Like to give him a thanks for helping the little guy out. Some the congressman was kind of has been vilified for his alleged role in the January or what has been dubbed the January 6th insurrection. But if you listen to the sound bites, the major media outlets did a hit on the congressman. So you would think that he was leading the charge instead of listening to his whole speech. And I was like trying to get the record straight for some of those out there. How are you, Mo?
I'm doing great. How about yourself today?
I'm good, sir. So, tell me the first question. I know you said President Trump asked you to come down there. What did you think that this crowd was going to be like? I mean, because I know you didn't had no idea this crowd was going to storm the Capitol later on.
Well, I've been to a lot of rallies in a lot of parts of the country over the decades, and I thought it was going to be like one of those, perhaps a little bit bigger because um, it was January the 6th. It was in the nation's capital, and Donald Trump was exhorting people to come and show their displeasure with the voting fraud that occurred in the 2020 elections. And quite frankly, the crowd that I gave the speech to, they were peaceful. They hoot and hollered when they thought it was appropriate to hoot and holler. They clapped, um, pretty much like most rally crowds I'd ever been to.
Did the president give you any type of direction or kind of influence you on what he wanted you to say?
No, he did not.
Okay. Um, so let's go over some of your speech a little bit because, like I said, they put the sound bites they put together was the media, they're just awful in major networks. But so you were talking about the Republicans in Congress because you made a comment and or one of the statements about they want to benefits get all the benefits from office, but don't put in the work or something like that.
Well, I did not anticipate we would get any votes of any Democrats about voter fraud because all of those Democrats benefited from that voter fraud. They're not about to bite the hand that feeds them. So my remarks were focused to a large degree on the Republican senators and congressmen who either had not done their homework or were afraid to point out the voter fraud that had occurred in the 2020 elections. So that was my primary focus when I was talking about congressmen and senators.
Okay, so what do you think that? So that's what they should have pointed out what was taking place with the voter fraud, correct?
Yeah, there was unquestionably voter fraud in the 2020 elections. I don't think that you can itemize the amount of voter fraud with any degree of certainty. And as a consequence, in those states where I believed that there was significant voter fraud that may have determined the outcome of an election, I was not voting to give those states to Donald Trump. I was voting to not count the states for anybody because just as we could not have known with any degree of certainty that Joe Biden won those states because of the voter fraud, similarly, we could not ascertain with any degree of certainty that Donald Trump won those states, again, because of the voter fraud and the uncertainty surrounding the quantity of voter fraud.
So would that have been constitutional for Mike Pence to send those ballots back to the states for recertification?
Well, it's never happened before to my knowledge, but I can't say it would have been constitutional or unconstitutional because, quite frankly, I do not think that the United States Constitution has given any clear guidance on the powers of the vice president under those circumstances. Certainly, Donald Trump was pushing as hard as he could for Mike Pence to do that. But I've known Mike Pence for over a decade. We used to sit next to each other on the House floor. He's as solid as they come. He's a very honest person. He's a very moral person. He's a very religious person. And I don't have any question in my mind but that he thought that he was doing what the law required him to do. And that was his motivation without any other motivation.
So, Congressman, what was the bill that Texas trying to block Pennsylvania's votes or something like that? How can you explain that? What they were doing there?
Well, there are three major sources of voter fraud. Again, the magnitude you can't ascertain because you haven't got the time, you haven't got the investigative resources. And quite frankly, once the Democrats or the election officials commingle ballots, you don't know which ones were cast illegally and which ones were cast legally. But the three main sources of voter fraud, from my perspective, the president had his own list, but I'm telling you what my list was. One, mass mail out of ballots. That is high risk. The Commission on Federal Election Reform, co-chaired by Democrat Jimmy Carter and Republican James Baker, who was Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, they had identified mass mail out of ballots as the number one source of voter fraud in elections. And they made that determination around 2005. So well over a decade before the 2020 elections. The second high risk area was we have illegal aliens who are voting in elections, non-citizens who are voting in elections. And presidential elections ought to be limited to American citizens. You've got one city, by way of example, San Francisco, that allows all adults to register to vote, regardless of whether they're illegally in the United States or if they're lawful non-citizens of the United States. You've got a number of other Democrat cities that do the same thing. And you've got a GAO, Federal Government Department, GAO report from about 2 decades ago, and it's probably worse now, that came to the conclusion that in some parts of the United States, as much as 3% of the registered voter list consist of non-citizens.
Wow.
And the study was based on this investigation. You have jury pools that are based on registered voters list. Then you have jurors in federal courtrooms who are dismissed from jury duty because it was determined by the court that they were not citizens of the United States, even though they were registered to vote. And so using that analysis and doing the hand count, the GAO determined that in some places in the United States, as much as 3% of the registered voters were not citizens of the United States and should not be voting in elections. Then the third area deals with the United States Constitution. It's got a provision in Article 1 that very plainly, very clearly limits the power to determine the, quote, time, place, and manner, end quote, of elections to legislative bodies of the 50 states. Back then it was 13, but it's 50 now, or to the United States Congress. No other governmental person or body, that includes the judicial system, has the right to alter what the legislature and Congress has determined the, quote, time, place, and manner will be, end quote, unless there is a conflict with another provision in the United States Constitution, like the Equal Protection Clause in the 5th and 14th Amendments, or in the 14th Amendment, or the provision that says you cannot discriminate against people based on race, okay? And we had secretaries of state, along with Supreme Courts of various states, along with various individual judges around the country, who were altering what the legislature and Congress had ordered to be done pursuant to the United States Constitution. Pennsylvania was one of those states where you had a Democrat Supreme Court, an activist Democrat Supreme Court, that was unilaterally changing election laws established by the United States Congress and or the legislature of the state of Pennsylvania, and in my judgment, in violation of the United States Constitution. Therefore, those votes were very much in question. Millions of votes were cast that way illegally. In Georgia, you had the Secretary of State enter into a rigged settlement agreement ratified by a judge that caused this mass mail out of ballots contrary to the laws established by the United States Congress and or the Georgia state legislature. So that put all those ballots in question as to whether they were legally cast or illegally cast. And so some of the states and their results were attacked on the basis that they were counting ballots that were illegal, cast in violation of the United States Constitution.
Okay, so Congressman, let me ask you, make sure I'm understanding. Do you believe that there was people who have obtained the ballots illegally, there was voter fraud, or there was just like mass voter fraud with people getting ballots that weren't supposed to have that were on the voter list, or a little both?
Well, an example would be Georgia. All of the ballots cast pursuant to this rigged settlement agreement between the Georgia Secretary of State and some Democrats that was ratified by a judge, all ballots cast pursuant to that system were cast in direct violation of the United States Constitution, Article 1.
Okay. So why was the Trump team not in court over this earlier?
Well, that brings up an entire different set of issues. The news media and the Democrats like to point at all these judicial decisions. And just as an aside, post swearing in of Joe Biden, you had a judge in Wisconsin rule that the attorney general had violated state law in the way in which the attorney general ordered what were basically Democrat ballots to be counted. You also had a judge or two in Pennsylvania who found that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had violated the law in the way in which it allowed certain ballots to be counted. But having said that, the reason that the courts were not ruling in Donald Trump's favor is because the courts were not supposed to rule in Donald Trump's favor, because the courts did not have jurisdiction. They did not have the authority under the United States Constitution and federal law to determine who wins or loses a state. Under the United States Constitution, the United States Congress is the final judge, arbiter, and jury to make that determination. So these courts, which are not equipped to handle these types of litigation in very short time frames, and if you've ever been to court, you know how long it takes, because it's complicated. It's a complicated process, and you have to afford different people discovery rights, and that takes time, doing depositions, requests for production of documents, or subpoenas for things. And the framers of our Constitution said, look, the determination of who is the president of the United States is not to be made by the courts. It's to be made by the United States Congress, because the United States Congress, with respect to congressmen, we're elected. And with respect to senators, at least back then, they were appointed by the state legislatures. Now they are elected. And so the framers of the United States Constitution did not want life-appointed judges determining who the president of the United States would be. There's no recourse when those judges make a bad judgment. There is recourse against elected officials. They can be defeated in the next election. And so there's an incentive for elected officials to get it right or lose their jobs. So this whole argument by the fake news media and the Democrats about these courts throwing these cases out, well, of course they were throwing them out because it wasn't their job to make that determination. Now, some people might come back and say, well, what about 2000 Bush v. Gore? Well, if you look at what the federal courts actually did, they did not declare who won the state of Florida. Congress made that determination, not the Supreme Court, not any lower federal court judge. In Bush v. Gore in 2000, the federal court said, look, we're not going to say who won Florida, but we are going to say that if you're going to recount ballots under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, you have to do it the same way in the totality of your state.
That's one question I was going to ask you. I watched not off topic. I watched a program on that the other night, and they said, the Bush or Gore team was wanting like 3 counties to be recount or done instead of the whole state. If that asked for a whole state recount, do you think it would have been different as far as carrying through with it?
I don't know what the outcome in Florida would have been if, from the very beginning, Florida had decided to recount ballots throughout the state, not just Democrat areas, but also Republican areas, and to recount them using the exact same process and rules throughout the state. I don't know, but I do know that the United States Congress, when it voted on January the 6th, of 2001 determined that George Bush won the state of Florida. And there is no appeal from that determination. What Congress determines concerning presidential races, and for that matter, congressional and senatorial races, is the final judgment. No court has the legal authority to overturn what we say as the United States Congress based on the United States Constitution.
So, Congressman, how long has this been going on, adding these illegal aliens to voting lists, voter fraud in these elections? Has this been something that's happened overnight or something that's systematic? Because I think Donald Trump got 80, or not Trump, Biden got 83 million votes. That was 14 more million than Barack Obama got. I mean, 24 million people showed up in these than did 2016. Where do all these people come from?
Well, part of it is non-citizens voting to an unknown degree. Heck, we don't even know how many non-citizens are in the United States, much less how many of them have had the audacity to register to vote. And I should add a terrifying word here about the National Voter Registration Act passed in, I think it was 1993, with the vote of Alabama's own Richard Shelby. Shame on Shelby. That legislation made it illegal for states to require proof of citizenship before someone could register to vote.
Wow.
You would think that the law would be, you got to have proof of citizenship because we only want citizens voting in our elections. But the Motor Voter Law of 1993, more formally known as the National Voter Registration Act, made it illegal for our voter registrars to require proof of citizenship. So that meant that the illegal door to voting by illegal aliens was wide open because they could go in and say, look, I want to register to vote. Pretty much the end of subject. And then to give you an idea as to how bad the problem is with some anecdotal evidence, go back to the national presidential debate in Nashville, Tennessee, in October of 2020, and you will see a segment in there in which Joe Biden was promising the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for illegal aliens. He was promising them amnesty if they elected him. And so you better believe, given our very, very lax voter registration system, given the impact of the National Voter Registration Act that prohibits our demanding proof of citizenship before registering someone to vote, that illegal aliens turned out in droves, and they turned out for Joe Biden because Joe Biden was promising them citizenship, that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And Joe Biden and his team knew that they were appealing to the non-citizen vote by making that statement in the presidential debate.
I'll ask you a tough question, Congressman. If there was this kind of voter fraud, wouldn't that swing all the down ballot races as well?
Yes, it would affect ballots across the ballot, from the bottom of the ballot to the top of the ballot and everything in between.
So then, according, we don't really know who should be in power of Congress then.
No, we do not. And quite frankly, in my judgment, the Democrats are not at all hesitant about engaging in voter fraud if it will increase their chances of winning an election. I'll give you an example. In 1982, I was the only substantive candidate running as a Republican for the legislature in the northern third of the state of Alabama, the only one. And it was a horse race. And on election day, I was distraught to discover that the Democrats had rigged 11 of the 45 machines so that they would register votes for everybody on the ballot except for Mo Brooks. 11 out of 45. Now, fortunately, as the day went on, most of those voting machines were repaired so that people could cast ballots for me and it would work and count those ballots. In one location, however, the voting machine was never fixed and I got 0 votes. At one location, which was in the heart of the Republican part of the district, there were 5 machines at that one voting location. None would register a vote for Mo Brooks. You could pull the straight Republican Party ticket, and you'd see the X's line up next to everybody's name except for mine. Mine was locked out. You could try to vote me, Mo Brooks, with the lever next to my name, and it was locked out. Okay. And the voting officials were astute enough and kind enough to periodically announce, hey, if anybody wants to vote for Mo Brooks, the machines won't register a vote for him, but you can sign your name on this sheet on the wall, and we'll count that as a vote for Mo Brooks. So people had to lose their secret ballot right at that box in the heart of the Republican part of the district to vote for me. Somehow or another, we still won with 57%. But I will never forget how the Democrats tried to steal that election because they didn't want a Republican breaching their stronghold in North Alabama.
So when they went there, so was that before the machines they have now, or was that
that was the old lever machines?
Okay.
Where you would go in, the curtain would close in behind you. You would pull a lever next to the candidate's name that you like, and a mechanical X would appear next to that name. And after you'd pulled all the levers that you wanted to pull with all the X's next to the candidate's name, you would then pull another lever, and that would add each of those votes to that candidate's name in the final total at the end of the day.
So I'm guessing some of your voters noticed that it wasn't registering and brought it to their attention?
All of them did. I was getting calls, hey, I thought I was in your district, but my machine wouldn't let me vote for you. And I'd say, well, where do you live? And they'd tell me, and I'd say, well, you do live in the district. And so you had a lot of voters who knew that they lived in my district complaining to the election officials about the machines being rigged to not count votes for Mo Brooks.
Carson, what's your opinion on the machines now? Because I figure they're sound, they're safe, and then I read this one article about one of the guys who does the software. Says, yeah, they can. I know they can be hacked. I do it for my class every year when we're teaching it. Do you think they can be hacked?
Well, the electronic voting machines are risky, but there's a way to minimize the risk, and the way to minimize the risk is to first require all electronic voting to be by paper ballot. And then second, to periodically test audit various machines around the state to ensure that the hand count of those paper ballots matches the electronic count of those paper ballots. And as long as you've got a random auditing system, you can have some degree of confidence that the voting machines are operating properly.
I know that's been a thing that's been brought up to me many times about these machines. And I don't know. We can't trust our election cycles. I mean, it'd be like Russia or something like that if they're already rigged. I mean, I don't want.
Well, let me add something in that regard. That was the primary argument of Mike Lindell and Donald Trump and company. But I never personally saw persuasive evidence that the electronic machines were rigged. To the contrary, you may recall that there was a hand recount of the ballots. I think it was in the Phoenix, Arizona area. And the totals from the electronic machines were very, 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 very close to the hand count total for well over 1 million ballots that were cast. And there's always going to be some discrepancy, and you don't know if it was a machine error or perhaps more likely an error by the people who were hand counting these ballots. So I never saw evidence to support the argument that the machines were rigged somehow. And I think as everybody has come to discover, there have been some lawsuits about this. And so far, the people who have been making that accusation have been paying out millions of dollars in damages to the voting machine manufacturers.
Do you know anything about voter fraud in Wisconsin? Because I was watching something about the attorney general let 200,000 people vote that wasn't supposed to, or
I don't have information on that. This is the first I've heard of it with respect to Wisconsin. The voter fraud that I did hear about in Wisconsin had to do with, I think it was nursing homes, where people would go in and persuade folks who lacked mental capacity to vote Democrat. And who knows how many times that occurred and whether that changed the outcome in the state of Wisconsin. That is a common ploy used by Democrats, is to go to nursing homes to help. That's in quotation marks, help someone to register to vote, when in fact what they're doing is they're helping people who lack the mental capacity to cast an informed ballot. And as such, the quote helper, end quote, is lining up a bunch of Democrat votes. That's a common ploy that the Democrats use.
And this has been going on for eons. Except for called the Kennedy Nixon races and stuff like that.
I am somewhat familiar with the Kennedy Nixon race, and if I recall correctly, it was in Illinois, in the Chicago area, where there was allegedly a lot of voter fraud. But Richard Nixon chose not to contest that. And it would have been the United States Congress that would have made the determination of who won. And if you count the noses, again, if I recall correctly, the Democrats controlled one or both houses of Congress. So there wasn't much chance of the outcome being changed.
You can watch on YouTube when they're during returns. Is it Brinkley and Hunt? I can't remember the name of the announcers, but they're sitting there talking, and one of them goes real quiet, and then he kind of looks at him and goes, "Something very strange has happened in the state of Illinois. Suddenly, Senator Kennedy is showing much more strength than he was just a few moments ago. With 90% in, he's now extended his lead to 38,000 votes above the vice president." And I think Pat Buchanan made the statement, the cemetery wars were coming in heavy for Kennedy.
Well, Chicago, New York City, and a number of other parts of the United States have a long history of stealing elections. You may recall Lyndon Johnson in Texas.
Yeah, I remember that. Was that when he was running for the House or the Senate?
It was, as I recall, his first time to run for the House or the Senate. But again, that's long before I have a memory of politics, and I haven't studied it, but I have read a little bit about it, enough to know that there were a lot of Republicans who were very upset, and to this day, to the extent they're still alive, they would contend that the only reason LBJ was such a powerhouse in the United States Congress is because he knew how to steal votes and get away with it.
So I'm going to ask you a couple more questions. I'll let you go because I know you got another one come up here. On January 6th, when you was talking about, fighting for your, and we got to fight, you were talking about like at the polls and.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about.
I think if I recall correctly, I mentioned in the 2022 and 2024 elections.
Oh, you mentioned that 2 or 3 times. You made it clear. You said this race is over this race's election is over 2 or 3 times. You said that, and let's get ready for 2022, 2024.
Yeah, use this as a motivation for getting better representation in the House and the Senate in the next election cycles. And in that context is when I was saying, take down names and kick ass. I was referring to those Republicans who were helping the Democrats defraud the American people with the voter fraud problems that we faced.
What was your thoughts later on when that actually took place when they stormed the Capitol?
I was angry when I discovered that the Capitol was being stormed. It's one thing for people to be outside and protesting loudly. They have every right to do that under the United States Constitution, First Amendment, freedom of speech, and freedom to petition the government for redress of your grievances. But they do not have the right to engage in criminal activity and violence and breaking and entering and things of that nature. And those people who engaged in that criminal conduct really torpedoed our effort to help the public understand the depth of the voter fraud in the 2020 elections. They gave the news media an easy out to talk about what was later portrayed as an attack on the Capitol by the news media. instead of talking about the speeches that we had lined up on the House floor detailing our reasoning for why we believe that we should not be counting the election results of various states.
So, what would have, I know you said this never did before. What would have actually happened, or do you have a guess that if we wouldn't have counted those states? What, or any idea what would have happened next? Would it have
Well,
went
at
to the
some
House?
point, you're going to have states with their election results that have been approved and those that have been disapproved, and the election would have been determined by the states that approved the election results. Now, one thing to keep in mind, there's a legal argument over, well, how do you vote on approval or disapproval of a state's returns? And I think the better legal argument is that each state delegation gets together and they vote on who the winner is. And then you add that all up, and we had a majority of the states being Republican. So if the Republicans had stuck together, Donald Trump could have been elected and sworn in January of 2021 if we voted by states instead of voting individually by senator or congressman.
Interesting. So that's how you think it would have played out, or it could have played out with no precedent. And it doesn't really say anything.
It could have gone either way, voting individually, which is how Nancy Pelosi wanted it done, or voting by states. Ultimately, that type of issue would have been determined by the Supreme Court. But there's pretty good language that says we're supposed to vote by state. So if there's 50 states, who wins 26 of them?
Okay. Did you feel the president tried to play you in front of that, or teach you in front of that crowd?
No, not at all.
Okay. So why did the president later pull his endorsement from you?
Well, the president, we're talking about Donald Trump.
Yes, sir.
He wanted me to take some positions that I knew were contrary to law. Probably the straw that broke the camel's back was when he called me up and he demanded that I publicly call for rescission of the 2020 election. Keep in mind, we're talking 2022, okay? Over a year after the election had taken place and over a year after Joe Biden had been sworn into office. He wanted me to publicly call for rescission of the 2020 election, the forcible removal of Joe Biden from the White House, the reinstatement of Donald Trump into the White House, and the calling for a new presidential election. And I said, Mr. President, I am very familiar with the federal statutes and the United States Constitution on this issue, and that is not permitted by the United States Constitution. And he came back and said, well, rescission is a remedy. And I said, well, I don't know if I said this out loud or I just thought it through my head since I'm an attorney and I've litigated a lot of different things. Rescission, by and large, is a common law remedy. That is the least persuasive and powerful of all sources of law, common law. The highest authority is the United States Constitution, which does not permit rescission. Federal statutes do not permit rescission. That's the second highest authority. And so when you have a conflict between laws, a conflict between common law and the doctrine of rescission, and the United States Constitution, the United States Code, the United States Constitution, the United States Code wins every time.
So let me ask Congressman, let's say just a couple more questions. Let's go. I know you're busy and kind of bounce all over the place, but I want to get your opinion on something. Let's talk about the fake news, or especially Yellowhammer News, who's on my Paul Sashi, who ran Katie Britt's several campaign. They did some major hits on you. What is your opinion of Alabama's media?
Well, Alabama's media is akin to the national media. It's bought and paid for. You can't trust any of it to tell the truth. That's not to say they're always lying. Sometimes they will tell the truth. Certainly, they'll be selective in picking what news they want to put forward to the public. News that they think helps their political ideology is much more likely to be broadcast on air or put out on the internet, as opposed to news that might hurt their political ideology. So that's part of what the news media does at the local, state, and federal level. But another part of it is they're just dishonest. So if you want to talk about Yellowhammer, having a political consultant who's paid by various candidates to help control the flow of news that voters look at, that's just plain wrong. You can't trust anything that Yellowhammer has to say, although on occasion it might say something that's truthful. So you still need to be mindful of what everybody's saying, and then you've got to determine for yourself what the truth really is and how much weight to give it.
Well said. I think that's all I have for you, Congressman. I know you got another one to go to, and
all right,
been here long enough. Hey, I appreciate your time, and
certainly
you have a great day, sir.
You too. Take care.